Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Brian Thatcher, and welcome to Mercy Unbound. It's a show that aims to provide hope, an avenue for healing, and one that will help you understand and then live the great mercy of God. With me today, I have Dr. Gerry Crete from Atlanta. Gerry has his PhD as a licensed Catholic professional counselor and marriage and family therapist. He's an internal family systems informed EMDR consultant. We're going to talk all about that. My understanding is, Dr. Crete, that EMDR is used in addictions and post-traumatic stress therapy primarily, but he has received training in ego state therapy, clinical hypnosis, and emotionally focused therapy. He's the author of the book that we're going to discuss today, Litanies of the Heart, relieving post-traumatic stress and calming anxiety through healing our hearts. Now, this book is available at Sophia, Sophia Institute.com. We're going to talk about a lot of the key points in this book. It's an excellent read. One who gave a strong recommendation in the book is Dr. Bob Schutz from Tallahassee. We've had him on the show, also his daughter and her husband, and just a wonderful man and family. And encourage our listeners and viewers to pull up Dr. Bob's show as well and his daughter's. Dr. Crete, you mentioned about being a wounded healer. That struck a nerve with me because I think anybody in the health professions is a wounded healer. Many of them just don't realize it. But one of my favorite books in the past was Henry Nouwen, Father Nouwen, who wrote the book Wounded Healer. And I've always felt that those who had their own struggles in life are better counselors because they have more empathy and they can understand what pain people have gone through. They're not just going through the motions. So I'm going to ask you to kind of open this show up with telling our viewers some of your own struggles and what it was like growing up. If I remember correctly, you grew up in Canada because I think you were a Bruins fan. And of course, we have Tampa Bay Lightning down here. So that's another show, another time. But tell us about your own growing up, if you would.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. I did grow up in Canada, and yeah, I mean, I had, I would say, a fair bit of trauma, especially around a father wound, and really difficult relationship with my father, who was abusive and often unemployed and often irritable and angry and just a very, very difficult relationship with him. I do kind of, in the different vignettes and stories in the book, I do kind of bring some of that, some of my own experience. I'm kind of bringing to the different characters a little bit of, various different stories kind of together, but there is a lot of me in there. And so what was interesting for me in my journey is that I've always had a strong desire to help people work through trauma. And in my early career, I first started out as a teacher. I was a high school teacher in Ontario. I was teaching history and English, but I gravitated toward teaching religious education as well. And then I moved into school counseling. I did a master's degree in that when I moved to Atlanta, and I was working in counseling, and I loved that. I love teaching. I love doing the school counseling work. I was thinking, well, where do I want to go next? And I decided to do a doctorate in counselor education. And I had initially thought, well, I will work on how can school counselors really be leaders, or I was thinking in the educational kind of realm at first. But what was really interesting is in my program at University of Georgia, they kind of got you to look at your life a little bit and looking at your deeper passions. And so I reflected on my own history of abuse. I reflected on my own childhood trauma. And that just started to come out in the different assignments and that we were doing in our coursework. And eventually, like what it led to, because at the same time I was moving into doing some clinical work for a counseling center. But it led to me studying trauma and bringing it, and especially I worked with, I thought of men and how men deal with trauma, or probably more likely how men don't deal with
Right,
trauma
right.
and avoid it. And so, I did all this research into that. I got really passionate about it. I started sharing my story more, even just within my program. And it really led me to write. My dissertation was on male survivors of childhood sexual abuse and healing that happens in relationship. And so, I did a lot of the focus of my clinical work had been working with male survivors of trauma, working with men struggling with sexual addictions or any kinds of addictions, and really looking at also anxiety and how anxiety comes from trauma and how we handle it. So, and that led ultimately to me even wanting to write this book, right, and wanting to really explore this issue of post-traumatic stress and anxiety that's just endemic, that's everywhere.
Now, when you start getting more and more into your education, was that the first time that you maybe felt a desire, or you realized that you had a part of you that was kind of maybe walled off and nobody knew or didn't know it was part of you, and then you felt like, okay, I gotta work on this because I'm going to help others.
Yeah, I had done actually a fair bit of work before then. One of the stories in the book really is a lot of my story, and it was initially being in my undergraduate college years in Kingston, Ontario, and having been mentored by a priest who at the time was using, I believe, the work of Matthew and Dennis Lynn, had written a book way back called Healing Life's Hurts. And this priest had read that and maybe some other things. And he actually did a lot of healing memories work with me. And so this was back when I was 18, 19, 20 years old. And it really had a profound effect on my life, and did some other counseling type work after that and spiritual direction. And so by the time I got to the place where, um, I was talking about it really in my doctoral program, I had done a lot of work, but I hadn't made the connection that my life experience and the healing that I had experienced could translate into sharing with the world in some way, sharing with others in some way to help others. And that's when I really woke up to that.
That's awesome. Now, if I remember in the book, that was Father Stephen, and at that point, he helped you realize you were a beautiful child of God, didn't he? And
Yeah, and that, and of course, the names are all changed and some details are changed, so it's to not identify any person, but the person who was Father Stephen. um, yeah, he really, well, I mean, I was fatherless really at that time, and he was really a father to me, and that just meant the world that he saw in me, yeah, a beloved child of God. He saw in me something that was beautiful. He wanted to mentor me. Well, I don't think. I know he thought he was kind of hoping to groom me toward the priesthood, and I considered it, discerned that at the time, but I was led to marriage. But I appreciate, but somehow that just meant a lot to me that he saw in me these gifts. He saw in me even some spiritual giftedness.
you discuss shame in the book, and how much shame you had of all the trauma you'd gone through. Um, Share with the audience the difference between guilt and shame.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a great question. There's a few different ways one can look at it. There's sort of a historical, more traditional Catholic way of looking at it, which kind of speaks to shame as an ultimately a corrective, right? And that guilt is something we feel bad about, we've done something wrong, and shame is that others see it. That's how I see the more traditional Catholic view. And it isn't. It can be a good thing in that when others see it, it calls us to conscience, or it can be used by others in a, what might say a shaming and a sort of a condemning way that ends up just sort of, is cruel or is just causes the spirit to shrink. But I do think there's a place for positive shame in those definitions. The more popular definition now that I actually really do like, and I think it's Brene Brown who brought it to popularity, is the idea that guilt says, I did something wrong. And shame says, I am wrong or I am bad. And I like that. I think that's a very helpful way of defining it and realizing, we're not at our core bad. Shame in that, by that definition, is always unhelpful, is always kind of is a self-condemnation. But guilt gives us a reason, yeah, we feel bad, but it gives us a reason to, hey, do something different. I can overcome guilt. I can repair. I can make it right.
I think of the scripture too, God hates the sin, but he loves the sinner. And when we're talking about shame, we're saying I'm bad intrinsically, and that's not how God sees us. But I want to talk a little bit about your book title, Litanies of the Heart. And you talk in there in your book about three original litanies of the heart. Um, share with us those litanies of the heart and how this fits into family therapy and things.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I originally wrote those three prayers before the book, and I wrote them in part because I was thinking about being creative and exercising some of my gifts and strengths in terms of kind of poetry or writing prayer, and that I felt called to. But what I was thinking of there was the psychological theory of attachment theory. I think is very profound. I think it's a useful way of understanding our insecurities, and it helps in understanding trauma as well. And the basic premise is that when we experience trauma, it causes we just basically lose touch with who we are and our sense of safety in the world. And that could be our sense of safety with God, our sense of safety with others, our sense of safety in ourselves. And so we're shaken up. And so we have to cope with that in some way. And we have different ways and styles of coping. And one way of coping is to be avoidant. So we avoid, we withdraw, we close up, we become like a turtle in its shell, right? And so that's one insecure attachment style is avoidant. And another way a person can cope is to be very anxious, be very reactive. In other words, they're on high alert. They're reacting to things, maybe in an drawn way. And so little cues cause a person to be worried and stressed and reactive. And then there's another type of insecure attachment style, other than avoidant and anxious, is one where you go back and forth between the two. And so there's these different attachment styles. And so I was thinking, where do we need attachment the most? And where do we sometimes lack attachment the most? And I think that's with God, ultimately. And so I was thinking, how can we grow into secure attachment with God? Because the goal of attachment theory is not to stay in our insecurities, of course. It's to actually develop attachment with others, right? That's safe, secure. And the way to do that is by being vulnerable with someone that we can trust, who is then going to be empathetic back to us, is going to be safe back to us, where we can disclose our struggles, our mistakes, our hurts, our pains, whatever it is. And they're going to care for that. They're going to value that, and they're going to be tender with that. And they're going to do the same with us. And we become stronger because we feel safe. Well, that's lovely and that's wonderful. And in emotionally focused couples therapy, that's the real foundation of what you try to do in helping couples get to that place. But I was thinking, how do we get to that place with God? Because I know a lot of people think things about God like, oh yeah, of course I learned God is love, or God loves me at my core, and all that. He forgives us and he loves each one of us and all these things. But deep down, if I really was faced with it, I would be saying God doesn't want me. I'm not good enough. If he really sees me, oh my gosh, I am, he would destroy me. He wouldn't want me deep down. So there's that difference between what our God concept is intellectually sometimes and what it really is in our heart. And so this whole prayer the litanies were written to kind of move from a place of, insecurity at the beginning. Jesus, here I am. I'm scared, or I'm closed off, or I'm anxious, or whatnot, and I go through that. And the statements that I use in there, I'm really taking from things that people have told me over and over again in my years of clinical practice. And so I think I'm speaking from where a lot of people are at the beginning, and we move from that, just Lord have mercy on me, here I am, move to a place of saying, Jesus, come to me, Jesus. heal me. Jesus, be with me. Jesus, hold me. And then ultimately, it comes to a place of, I trust in you. And so there's a surrender. So each litany kind of has this little motion, if you will, that is designed to help a person move toward that secure attachment with Christ.
I really enjoyed the book because you write of the internal family systems, and that each of us has this internal system like a little family with many parts working together, but yet there's parts that aren't healthy and they're not working well. Um, how does this work in therapy and different from other types? How do you get the person to heal?
Yeah, yeah. I think that a lot of therapy, the main types, like the most popular type right now would probably be cognitive behavioral therapy. And so it's very much just looking at the person and identifying what their uh, uh, thoughts are and the underlying beliefs that are false that cause person to have these strong emotions. And then you challenge those thoughts and those beliefs, and then the emotions change positively. And that's great as far as it goes. And it's a very popular method, but it's basically looking at the person as if they're just one thing you're dealing with. And I think even if you go all the way back to in the history of psychology, there tends to be that sense in which the personality is just one thing. But I think the reality is that that's not true. And if you really do look at the history of psychology, it's over and over again, even if we're talking about Freud or Carl Jung or any of these early guys, um, they're really talking about a complex inner world. And so what internal family systems does and what ego state therapy does, and in a few of the other types that preceded those, is it looks at the interior world as having multiple personalities. It's not talking about a disorder or DID or anything. I'm talking about just we naturally have multiple personalities. We naturally have different parts of the self that are, that have different qualities, different strengths, different resources, but also different burdens, different struggles, and so on. And so when we do this kind of work, I just say parts work, because I draw from internal family systems, I draw from ego state therapy, I draw from EMDR. But in this parts work, in therapy, you're actually helping a person to look inward, kind of like you might if you were meditating. And they look inward and you discover and connect with your different parts. And you realize you really can communicate with them. And you can do some work where you're kind of unblending from them, because the part's kind of like, we think that's who we are at the moment, is this part, and that because it's a part that's kind of active. Like if I have a part of me that's like a workaholic and a task oriented part because I'm at work or whatever, then that part is kind of dominant in that moment. But then a different aspect of me shows up when I'm socializing, maybe, or when I'm just kind of relaxing or something, or a different part of me shows up when I'm parenting, or and so on. And so we have these different parts, but we also have parts that are more wounded. Think of like inner child. You might have heard of like the inner child stuff. Well, I think those are true. Like we have parts that are, we say, exiled. So they're parts that are kind of pushed out of our conscious, most of the time out of our conscious thinking, but they're there. And when we bring them into our conscious awareness and we actually connect with them, we can do some healing work with them. So this work is about discovering these different parts, bringing them closer, but gaining a distance internally so that we can actually communicate and do healing work with all of these parts. So it might be even a sense in doing cognitive therapy, like we talked about, like I mentioned, but you're doing it kind of like with different parts because they each have different needs. And so what you're doing is you're actually helping create an inner world, helping the person, they're doing it, the work, that is in harmony, and that our parts are healthy and they're not burdened with shame or burdened with past memories that are overwhelming, or burdened with fear, or burdened with deep, profound sadness and isolated within. And then we're not even fully aware that we're having sometimes these parts that are so dysregulated within us, and we're not even aware half the time, like, why am I sad, or why am I really anxious, or why we're not aware. And when we look inside and we discover and meet these parts and we learn to love them, care for them, and heal them, It honestly, it's the most transformative therapy that I've ever done in my entire clinical career of working with people.
This may not be an easy one to answer in a few sentences, but okay, so if people kind of suppress all these thoughts from childhood and injuries and things like that, and you bring them to the consciousness and they talk about them, then how do you help them heal from that or come to grips with all that?
Yeah. Well, one key that I think is really cool is this concept of self. And what's interesting to me is that Richard Schwartz in internal family systems, he's the guy who developed it starting in the 1980s. And he's secular, like he's not coming at it from a Christian perspective or anything. And one of the amazing things he discovered was that when he was working with people and he was starting to use this method of helping them kind of like connect with their parts. Once he was doing that, he called it unblending. So you unblend all these different parts and you kind of get to know them. What he saw and discovered that a self showed up, and the self was naturally compassionate, naturally calm, naturally kind of creative, naturally kind of patient. It had these qualities, and he couldn't understand it. He said it didn't matter who the person was. This showed once you did this kind of work, that self showed up. Well, I think what he discovered was the inmost self that St. Paul talks about in Romans. I think what he discovered is the image of God in that person, the deepest core spiritual center. He just wouldn't have used that language. And so even at a natural level, even with a person who isn't necessarily even baptized or, living in Christ or whatnot, they naturally have those qualities embedded deep down in their heart of hearts and their soul. And he was accessing them. So as I was thinking about this, it caused me to think, imagine how much even more powerful this method would be if we actually gained awareness of the inmost self as the deep spiritual center of the soul that was able to access God's grace. That was, in a sense, a mediator between the whole human heart and God's love, and the infused graces of faith, hope, and love, and what it would look like for in a sense that grace and that inmost self to be able to love and take care of the various parts. How much more even transformative and healing would that be? And so that's where I saw the integration, and it started to me to explore this whole topic of how is this parts work approach that I discovered, is it first of all, is it compatible with our faith, and how is it? And that led me into exploring the scriptures, the church fathers, the saints, and all this kind of thing, which led to this book.
And the healing methods you use are all compatible with the teachings of the Catholic Church, correct?
Yes, exactly, and I believe so. I think the book hopefully demonstrates that. What's interesting was that there were places in, for example, internal family systems that I was scratching my head that I didn't appreciate. Like I noticed Richard Schwartz in his own journey, like his earlier stuff is very neutral, secular neutral. So it's just sort of clinical and interesting and useful. As time went on, he became more and more spiritual,
No.
and they began to see this method as a spiritual method, not just a therapeutic method. And then he started to write, like when he wrote No Bad Parts a few years ago, one of his popular books, he was much more explicit than he ever had been, that he saw the self as like a little piece, a little droplet, like a water droplet in the ocean of the larger self, which he doesn't call it God per se, but it's like the universe or something. And so he was starting to use this language that, to me, I'm like, well, that sounds pantheistic. That sounds very new age. That sounds kind of Buddhist or Hindu kind of in so much of the formulation. And so I got really concerned about that. And that led me to then explore, really look deeply at what he was saying in No Bad Parts, but also then compare it and contrast it with what our faith says. And so this book is really an attempt to say, no, parts work is inherent in our Christian faith, actually, but it needs to, if you're going to use IFS, you need to adapt it.
Uh, again, we're talking about the self, and you mentioned it's inherently good. You also mentioned about the 8 C's and the 5 P's. Could you share with us what those were and how that all ties into the intimate
Yeah.
self?
Yeah, so that's Richard Schwartz discovered those 8 C's and 5. So those are the things he named, and I named a few of them: compassion, creativity, calm, courage, curiosity. Though he has the eight, they're all letter C, and then the 5 P's, like patience, perspective, persistence, playfulness, and presence. So he came up with those, and I think they're beautiful and powerful, and really do speak to who the self is. But it also led me down a path of saying, what does the history of our faith say? How does virtue play into this? Because we have these infused virtues, but we have all these other virtues, and are they inherent to the inmost self? Are they things because we have the infused virtues that you don't actually develop, they're just sort of you access.
Yeah.
But then we have other virtues that you do have to develop. You do have to have the habit and form them. And so in a way, those are what I think the parts can develop, those virtues, so to speak. But it also led me to look at this question, that I think is one of the things in my book that I'm proud of, other than the litanies themselves, that I kind of did creatively, as opposed to just integrating different things together, which is also creative. But I really appreciated. I took a moment and I said, who is the embodiment of the inmost self, or the prototype, or the role model for the inmost self? Well, it has to be Jesus Christ. And so I looked at the Gospels and I did a like little mini phenomenological analysis of Christ in the Gospels. And from that, in phenomenology, you looked at the lived experience of something, but you code the different things that you notice in the behavior of a person, or and so on, and then you group them into themes. And so I did that, and that's where I came up with, I forget now which chapter, but I identify in Christ these different qualities that, I mean, they're aligned with the 8 C's and the 5 P's, but it's like Christ is a nurturer, Christ is a lover, Christ is a friend, Christ is a seeker, Christ is a protector, Christ, and it's all these different qualities of Christ that Christ exhibited, that I believe that as we're in the image of God, that our inmost self has those qualities, and can exercise those same qualities and be Christ-like, therefore, with the parts. And when we do that, when we are Christ-like and loving to our parts, and we have internal harmony within, then we're able to actually love others, more fully, more completely, and ultimately love God more fully. And then I think we really are responding to the commandment to love our neighbor as ourself. Because if we don't love ourself at all, and how we're not really loving our neighbor. And so I see this whole model as a way of properly loving the self in order to love others and God.
One area I really enjoyed reading, and you mentioned it, was the exiled part. Can you delve into that a little deeper? And aren't these part of our woundedness? And then how do you bring that to healing?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a great question, and it's complex. I will give a little brief kind of way of looking at it. I mentioned before the wounded child part. So we have parts that I would say are kind of stuck in time. They're still with us, but they're stuck in time. They often show up as very young parts. They're not always, but I would say 98% of the time, it's an exile is a child, shows up that way. And so it's a part that something terrible happened, and it could be really terrible, like sexual abuse or a war type event or something, or major loss. But it can be even things like bullying. It could be things that we consider to be, difficult and challenging and somewhat traumatic, but common. And so we experience those moments as overwhelming in the system. And so and they usually involve the most serious emotions, the strongest emotions: fear, shame, pain are the three biggies, maybe sadness as well, or loneliness possibly too. But what happens is those emotions and those experiences are so overwhelming to the person that the protective measure is to push that out of consciousness. And so then we develop protectors. Other parts take on the role, like of maybe a manager, that his job or her job is to make sure that that exile stays exiled. We don't want to deal with that because it's too much. And so those are where, you know, a manager might be, like I was mentioning, like a worker part or a task oriented part. Well, that's where it can become a workaholic in an effort to just keep that exile away, not leave any space for it. And so we have these different manager parts, as we call them, that keep the exile away as we're functioning our regular life. But sometimes, of course, things happen, right? We get overwhelmed with stress, or something happens that triggers us or something, and the managers can't handle it, right, like they used to. And then that exile kind of shows up with its emotion, with its strong pain, shame, fear, let's say, one of them, or both, or three. And we have other parts, we call them firefighters, that leap into action to say, to like make sure that the exile stays pushed away. And so unlike the managers, they don't care what anybody thinks, and they're just more about do whatever it takes. And like a firefighter just takes out the fire. And those can be behaviors like alcohol use, drug use, pornography use. It can be anger, and can show up as like anger and irritability and really difficulty. It can show up it could be something like even that would be normally a good thing, but like over exercising or over maybe playing video games or zoning out, some numbing out behavior often. And so our system is designed in a way to keep those exiles far away. And so what we want to do, though, is we want to, in this work, is get in there, and we have to work with those managers and firefighters, and we have to kind of win them over to realizing that the only way our system is going to get healthy and going to have true harmony is if we actually bring the exiles in. And they're not going to want to do that right away. They're not, because they've been coping for a long time with all these strategies to keep it away. So, you know, and in the book, there's every chapter is sort of a different step towards getting, you know, healing. And so at the beginning, it's about just identifying who these parts are. And we learn how to unblend. We learn how to connect with these managers. We learn how to befriend them. We learn how to help our managers realize, our protectors realize where the self is available. Because sometimes these parts, they're not even aware of the self, really. Like, we're so disconnected from this core spiritual center. And then once they get trust with the self, once there's this connection, they realize, whoa, the self is there to heal, to love. It's got this grace with it too. Christ's presence is there. The Holy Spirit can work through this. Whoa. And the parts come, you know, agree. You have to have permission. And when they agree to let us in, to let a person in, to actually connect with that exile. And then you meet with the exile. You start by noticing it. You start by seeing what's going on. You might ask the exile about its story. You want to develop some kind of trust. You notice how the self, the core self, feels toward it. And all of a sudden, when you clear away the path, what comes is the inmost self invariably is filled with love and compassion for this child who's been hurt. And what wasn't obvious when you were 6 or 7 or 9 to do, because you couldn't have done it for yourself then, is I want to go in and hold that child. I want to love that child. I want to remove its burden. I want to help it. And then there's a process to do that. It's a later chapter in the book on unburdening. And when that happens, then you realize this child is beautiful and childlike, playful, lovely. And it's like, now we can bring that child in, no longer exiled, bring it into the system. And the other parts they're no longer afraid of it. They were afraid of this little kid all this time, right? It's crazy. And now the whole system can like work better together and love each other better. And this child is part of the system. And people report, like, just after this experience of unburdening these exiles and bringing them in, just like lightness and like this burden lifted, and they're just happier. And and that playfulness is now accessible to the whole person.
Let me give you an example and help me on this. Say a child has been abused physically, emotionally, whatever. Would one of the ways that those exiled parts might cope or handle it would be to become overprotective to others in an exaggerated way that isn't really healthy? I don't know if I'm making sense on this, but
No, you are. Yeah, like that wouldn't be usually the exile itself. That would be the manager. So
okay.
the manager becomes over helpful to people, and you see that even with well-intentioned counselors or well-intentioned spiritual directors or pastors or whatever. And they become overly helpful to other people as a way of coping with, in a way, sometimes as a way of not dealing with their own wounded child. So they're busy trying to help everybody else's kind of thing. If, so that would be a protective function. And the whole point with these protectors is that their intentions are really good. Right. And you have to acknowledge that and thank them for that, and realize that in order, as part of your method, to say, but I want to show you a new way to do things. If you're willing, that you won't have to try so hard. Right. We still need that part in all its love and all its goodness and all its desire to help others, but it won't have to do it with this burden of thinking I have to do it or else, I'm bad, or else I'm not good enough, or something along those lines.
Yeah. I want to again mention the book because it really is an excellent read. Litanies of the Heart, reliving post-traumatic stress and calming anxiety through healing our parts, available at sophiainstitute.com. Stephen, how do people reach you if they want to get help or get into counseling or?
Yeah, it's Gerry. Stephen's the priest,
Yeah,
but
yeah. Sorry about that.
no, you're fine. Yeah, so I have a practice called Transfiguration Counseling and Coaching, and it's transfigurationcounseling.com. And I have a whole group of therapists and coaches that are trained in this model, and we work together, and so we provide counseling and coaching services in multiple states. The coaching services we can do all across the country. The counselors have to be licensed in their states. But we have that. There's also soulsandhearts.com, which is another ministry that I do with Dr. Peter Malinowski, and where he really we are together integrating the Catholic faith with IFS, and there's online communities. We have the newsletter with this fantastic information about it. So between Transfiguration Counseling and Souls and Hearts, you can reach me or learn more about all of this as well.
Any closing thoughts for the people who are watching this that you just want to share?
Yeah. I really just hope you'll join me on this journey. Like, I wrote this book. I did have like more serious like cases, like in terms of abuse and trauma, and that shows up in the stories. But I kind of feel that all of us have trauma, and all of us struggle with anxiety, and more anxiety in this world, right? Where we're constantly bombarded with frightening information, and sometimes we don't even know what to do with it. And so I really was hoping this book would help all of us learn ways, really helpful ways to reduce our anxiety and draw closer to God. Ultimately, I hope that's what it accomplishes.
Well, you've done a beautiful job, and you mentioned Jesus, I trust in you. Of course, that's the words that he wanted printed below the image of divine mercy behind me. And trust is easy when everything's going well, but it's not so easy when they're not. But Dr. Crete, I really want to thank you for joining me today on Mercy Unbound. I hope our paths cross again soon, and maybe down the road we can get you back and we can get into this more, because I've really enjoyed this and found it fascinating. So keep up the great work.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here with you too.
Thank you. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for the video portion. The podcast can be heard at anchor.fm/drbrian, Bryan Thatcher, Thatcher, and on all the major podcast forums. I would love to speak at your church or conference, and please consider supporting our efforts to spread the truth to a hurting world. Thank you again. And for more information, go to the website at drbrianthatcher.com.